The orbital bombardment lasted 17 minutes. Commander watched from the mountain cave as blue fire rained down on the valley below. The resistance base had held 300 fighters. Now it held nothing but glass and ash. This was the fifth time in 2 years. The fifth time the Galactic Liberation Front had gathered its forces, planned an attack, and been crushed before the first shot was fired. The hegemony did not need to fight battles. They simply erased problems from orbit. Was his scaled skin the deep green of his world's forest regions? He had been a decorated officer in the Planetary Defense Force before the came. That had been 23 years ago. He remembered the day their massive ships appeared in the sky, blotting out the sun. His people had fought bravely. It had not mattered. They had weapons that bent reality itself. After 6 days, his government surrendered. The occupation had been brutal but efficient. They did not care about culture or politics or the lives of those they conquered. They wanted resources and obedience, had rich farmland that grew food they needed. So worked the fields while soldiers patrolled the cities and automated drones watched from above. The resistance had started small, angry young people throwing rocks at patrols, sabotaging equipment. It had grown slowly over the years, but every time they tried something bigger, they found them. The hegemony had surveillance systems that tracked every movement, every conversation. Their AI could predict attacks before they happened. And when they found a resistance cell, they did not just kill the fighters. They destroyed entire districts. They killed families. They made examples. Turned away from the burning valley. Only 20 fighters had been in the cave with him, gathering supplies when the strike happened. 20 survivors from 300. The others were arguing about what to do next. Some wanted to scatter and hide. Some wanted revenge. A few wanted to surrender. The argument stopped when Young came running into the cave. She was breathing hard, her communication device clutched in her hand. "Commander, we caught a ship," she said. "A small one. It was trying to sneak past the patrol grid. We pulled it down with the old mining tractor beams." Felt tired. They barely had enough people to survive, let alone take prisoners. But protocol was protocol. They needed to know who was entering their space. "Where is it?" "The eastern landing field. The crew is alive. Sir, they're strange. I have never seen their species before." That made curious despite his exhaustion. The controlled 1,000 worlds. Most of the species in this region were known to the resistance network. A new species was rare. He took 10 fighters and made the 3-hour trek to the old landing field. It had been a commercial port before the invasion, now just cracked concrete and rusted equipment. The ship sat in the middle of the field, surprisingly intact. It was smaller than a typical cargo hauler, with smooth lines and an unfamiliar design. The crew was sitting on the ground, hands visible, clearly trying to look non-threatening. There were 4 of them, stared. They looked almost in basic shape, 2 arms, 2 legs standing upright. But their skin was smooth and pale, without scales. Their faces were flat with strange, mobile features. Hair grew from their heads in various colors. One of them stood slowly. It was male, tall and solid, with short brown hair going gray at the edges. He raised his hands higher. "We are not your enemies," he said in perfect galactic standard. "We did not come here to fight." "Then why are you here?" asked, his weapon still raised. "Bad luck," a female said. She had darker skin and black hair pulled back from her face. "We were exploring this region. Our people only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. We did not know this area was controlled by the until their patrols started shooting at us." "What species are you?" "Humans from a planet called Earth." "Had never heard of either. You will come with us. If you cooperate, you will not be harmed." They were taken back to the cave complex. Had them put in a secured chamber, not exactly a cell but guarded. He was too tired to interrogate them properly. The loss of 300 people weighed on him. He sat in his command room, such as it was, and stared at reports that meant nothing now. Brought him food he did not eat. She sat down across from him. We cannot keep doing this, she said quietly. We fight, they kill us, we hide, we try again. It never changes. I know. Then what do we do? Had no answer. He had been fighting for 15 years. He had watched friends die. He had made impossible choices, and they were no closer to freedom than when he started. The next morning, he went to talk to the prisoners. The humans were sitting together, talking quietly. They stopped when he entered. You will be released, said. We will give you supplies to repair your ship. You will leave this system and not return. We saw what happened yesterday, the female said. The orbital strike. Said nothing. We have seen this before, she continued. On our own world, many times throughout our history, an overwhelming force occupying a weaker people. Then you know it is hopeless. No, she stood up. I am Dr. Sarah. I study history, specifically the history of resistance movements on Earth, and I can tell you that occupations fail. They always fail eventually, but not the way you are fighting them. Felt anger flare. You know nothing about our fight. I know you are trying to fight them like an army, the male said, also standing. I was a soldier on Earth. I fought in asymmetric wars. You cannot beat thee in open battle. You will never have the ships or weapons to match them, so you have to stop trying. Then what would you have us do? Surrender. Change how you fight, Sarah said. Make it too expensive for them to stay. Make every day of occupation cost them more than they gain. You do not need to defeat their military. You need to break their will. Laughed bitterly. They have no will to break. They are machines of empire. Every empire has limits, said. How many worlds do they control? Nearly 1,000. Then they are already stretched thin. They cannot garrison every world with overwhelming force. They rely on fear and their surveillance systems. You can break both. How? Sarah and looked at each other. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Let us show you, Sarah said. Over the next week, gathered the surviving GLF leadership. 37 people, all that remained of the command structure. They met in the deepest cave, where even scanners could not penetrate. The human stood before them with a portable display. Sarah began to speak. You are fighting a conventional insurgency, she said. You gather forces, plan attacks on military targets, try to seize weapons and territory. This is what they expect. Their systems are designed to counter it. You need to become something they cannot predict. She showed images from Earth's history. Guerrilla wars fought in jungles and cities. Occupations that collapsed despite the occupiers' military superiority. Tactics that seemed small but accumulated into strategic victories. You need to think about this differently, added. Every attack should have a purpose beyond killing enemies. You want to influence their decision-making, make them afraid, make them doubt, make them spend resources protecting things that do not matter. We have no resources, one commander said. They took everything. You have time, knowledge of your own world, and popular support, Sarah said. Those are the three things occupiers can never truly control. You use improvised weapons. You strike at their supply lines, not their strong points. You make them come to you where you have the advantage. They will kill civilians in response, said quietly. They always do. Sarah nodded, her face serious. Yes, it is the ugliest part of this kind of war, but they are already killing civilians. Every day of occupation kills your people through brutality, starvation, and despair. What I am describing does not make it worse. It makes it end faster. Stepped forward. I can teach your fighters small unit tactics, how to move without being seen, how to build weapons from common materials, how to attack and disappear before they can respond. Sarah can help you with something equally important, the information war. Information war? Asked. Everything you do has an audience, Sarah explained. Other resistance cells on other worlds, soldiers who might be questioning their orders, even the leadership. You document their crimes. You show the cost of occupation. You prove they can be hurt. You make them look weak and afraid. The other commanders were listening now, leaning forward, saw something in their faces he had not seen in years. Not hope exactly, but something like it. Possibility. "Why would you help us?" he asked. "You could leave. This is not your war." Sarah smiled sadly. "Humanity has fought countless wars. We have been occupied and been occupiers. We have made terrible mistakes, but we learned one thing through all that blood and fire. Freedom matters. People who want to be free will eventually find a way. We can show you the path, but you will have to walk it." Added besides, the fired on our ship. They tried to kill us for entering the wrong space. That makes it our fight too. Looked at his commanders. He saw the same exhaustion he felt, but also something stirring underneath. They had been fighting and dying for nothing. Now, maybe, there was a different way. "Teach us," he said. The training began the next day. Took the fighters into the wilderness in groups of 5. He taught them to move through the forest without leaving tracks. He showed them how to use the terrain, how to set up ambushes, how to hit and run. Most importantly, he taught them to think small. "You are not trying to win a battle," he said over and over. "You are trying to make them bleed, a little bit every day, death by 1,000 cuts." He showed them how to build improvised explosives from fertilizer and fuel, how to create tripwires and pressure plates, how to disguise a bomb as ordinary debris. They were good students. They had been farmers and workers before the war. They knew chemistry and engineering. Sarah worked with a different group. She taught them about cameras and editing and storytelling, how to document atrocities in ways that made people angry, how to film their own operations to look more effective than they were, how to create propaganda that spread like a virus through underground networks. "The goal is not just truth," she explained. "It is persuasion. You want people on other worlds to see you winning. You want them to see themselves losing. You want every civilian to believe resistance is possible." She showed them how to encrypt messages so they could not trace them, how to use old commercial satellites to broadcast on frequencies the hegemony did not monitor, how to turn the enemy's own surveillance systems against them by feeding false information. Watched the transformation with amazement. His people were learning to think like shadows, like ghosts. They stopped planning big attacks and started planning dozens of small ones. They stopped trying to hold territory and started making territory impossible to hold. After 3 months, they were ready. The first attack happened on a supply convoy traveling between the capital and a mining operation. 6 trucks protected by 2 armored vehicles and a drone escort. In the old way, the GLF would have tried to ambush it with superior numbers, hopping to overrun the guards before reinforcements arrived. They would have lost dozens of fighters and maybe captured some weapons. Instead, 5 fighters hit them on a remote stretch of road. They detonated explosives under the lead vehicle, blocking the convoy. Then they destroyed the rear vehicle, trapping everyone in between. They poured fire into the trucks from elevated positions, focusing on the cargo rather than the guards. After 90 seconds, they vanished into the forest. The reinforcements arrived 10 minutes later. They found burning wreckage and dead soldiers. They found no attackers. They found a symbol spray-painted on the remaining truck, the GLF emblem with words in human English underneath. "You cannot kill us all." The garrison commander ordered a retaliatory strike on the nearest village. His drones leveled 30 buildings and killed 42 civilians. By morning, footage of the massacre was playing on screens across. The dead had names and faces. There were children in the rubble that looked like the monsters they were. 3 districts erupted in riots. While the garrison struggled to contain them, GLF cells struck 6 more targets: a power station, a water treatment facility, a communication relay. Small attacks but coordinated. Each one made life a little harder for the occupiers. The doctrine was working. 6 months after the humans arrived, the garrison had lost over 200 soldiers. They controlled the cities barely, but the countryside belonged to the resistance. Supply convoys needed heavy escorts. Patrols went out in large numbers or did not come back. Collaborators were disappearing. The surveillance network kept getting hacked. The garrison commander requested additional troops. His request was one world among 1,000. Resources were limited. In a cave that changed locations every 3 days, studied maps with Sarah, and red marks showed successful operations. Blue marks showed responses. The pattern was clear. The enemy was reacting instead of acting. They were afraid. "The other worlds are watching," Sarah said, pointing to intercepted communications. "Resistance cells on V, they are asking how we did this." Looked at the two humans. They had changed everything. They had given his people something more valuable than weapons or ships. They had given them a way to win. "Then we teach them," he said. "We write down everything. We send it to every world that wants to be free." Nodded slowly. "It will spread fast. They will panic. Things will get worse before they get better." "They cannot be worse than they are," said. "We were dying slowly under their boots. Now at least we can fight." Sarah pulled up a document on her portable computer. "We will call it the Liberation Handbook. Simple instructions, tactics, communication security, propaganda techniques, everything a resistance cell needs to start." They worked for 2 weeks, translating and simplifying. When they were done, the handbook was 300 pages of concentrated knowledge. Everything humanity had learned about asymmetric warfare, adapted for the occupation. The first copies went out encrypted in commercial data streams. They were passed hand to hand on data chips. They were memorized and recited. Within a month, 17 worlds had received it. Within 2 months, cells on 40 worlds were reorganizing along human principles. The hegemony's intelligence services noticed something was wrong. Attack patterns were changing across multiple worlds. The insurgencies were becoming more effective, more coordinated. They could not understand why. Mining workers started a slowdown that looked like equipment failures. Production dropped by 40%. Engineers could not find the cause. On V, urban cells began a campaign of targeted assassinations against high-ranking officers. 3 colonels died in 2 weeks. The entire port system ground to a halt as resistance hackers corrupted the logistics network. Each world was unique, but the doctrine was the same. Make occupation expensive. Show no mercy to collaborators. Document everything. Never present a target for the enemy's superior firepower. The hegemony responded with increased brutality. Orbital strikes became more common. Entire cities were placed under curfew. Executions were broadcast as warnings. But this only fed the resistance. Every atrocity was documented. Every massacre created new recruits. The violence that was supposed to terrify people into submission instead convinced them they had nothing to lose. Listened to reports from other worlds with growing excitement. The fire was spreading. The doctrine was working everywhere it took root. They could not fight ghosts. They could not bomb ideas. They could not surveil people who had stopped trusting their own systems. "We need to coordinate," he said to Sarah, "and the cells on different worlds need to share information to time their attacks." "That is dangerous," warned. "More communication means more chances of being intercepted." "It is also necessary," Sarah said. "Right now, each world is fighting alone. If we can coordinate them even loosely, they will be overwhelmed. They cannot reinforce 40 worlds at once." They built a network, not a command structure but a communication system. Cells on different worlds could share intelligence, warn each other of movements, and coordinate operations. It was decentralized and encrypted. If one node was compromised, the others survived. The network grew slowly at first, then rapidly. Within 6 months, over 60 worlds were connected. The GLF was no longer just resistance. It was becoming something much larger. A year after the humans arrived, the High Command held an emergency meeting. Their empire was fracturing. 50 worlds were in open rebellion. Another 100 had active insurgencies that were draining resources. The military was stretched impossibly thin. Economic output was dropping as the cost of occupation soared. What changed? The Supreme Commander demanded. These primitives were contained. Now they are everywhere. Unknown, Supreme Commander, his intelligence chief replied. But the pattern suggests coordination. The tactics are similar across multiple worlds. Someone is teaching them. Then find the source and eliminate it. But there was no single source to eliminate. The doctrine had spread too far. The handbook existed in 1,000 places. Even if they killed the humans, it would not matter. The knowledge was out there. The resistance was alive. On, in a cave deep in the mountains, received a message from a resistance cell on, a world on the far edge of the hegemony. They had driven the garrison off-planet. It was the first world to achieve complete liberation. He showed the message to Sarah and they were smiling, but their eyes were tired. They had been fighting for 18 months straight, training fighters, planning operations, and staying one step ahead of death squads. One world, Sarah said quietly, 999 to go. It is a start, said. He looked at these strange humans who had changed everything. Thank you for all of it. Shook his head. Do not thank us yet. This is going to get much worse. They will escalate. They will try to make examples. Some worlds will be destroyed before they are freed. I know, said, but now we have a chance. Before you came, we had nothing but despair and death. Now we have hope that is worth any price. Outside the cave, young fighters were training its methods. In the communications room, Sarah's students were editing footage and preparing broadcasts. The resistance was growing, learning, becoming something that could not stop. The war for 1,000 worlds had truly begun. 2 years after the humans arrived on, the hegemony was dying. The Supreme Commander stared at reports that all told the same story: collapsing authority, rising costs, plummeting morale. Of their 1,000 occupied worlds, they had been forced to withdraw from 200 completely. Another 300 were contested, with forces confined to their bases. The remaining 500 required constant reinforcement to maintain control. The military was exhausted. Soldiers were deserting. Officers were requesting transfers to the core systems. Nobody wanted to serve in the occupation forces anymore. The pay was not worth the risk of being killed by an unseen enemy who could strike anywhere at any time. Worse, the economy was collapsing. The hegemony had conquered 1,000 worlds for their resources, but those resources were not flowing anymore. Rebellious workers sabotaged equipment. Resistance cells destroyed infrastructure. Supply lines were constantly under attack. The empire was spending more to hold the territories than it gained from them. We need to negotiate, the economic minister said. We are bleeding ourselves dry. We do not negotiate with terrorists, the Supreme Commander snarled. Then we will lose everything, the minister replied coldly. We can either accept a managed withdrawal or wait for complete collapse. Those are the only options left. The Supreme Commander knew he was right, but admitting defeat was unthinkable. The hegemony had never lost a war. They had conquered species and broken empires. How could they be beaten by scattered insurgents with improvised weapons? The answer was simple, though he could not accept it. They had been beaten by an idea, a human idea. The doctrine of asymmetric resistance had spread faster than they could contain it. Every brutal response had created more enemies. Every atrocity had been documented and broadcast. Every world liberated had inspired 10 more to rise up. On was now the overall coordinator of what had become a truly galactic resistance network. The cave had been abandoned for a mobile command ship, constantly moving between liberated systems. The GLF had transformed from a desperate band of fighters into a sophisticated organization spanning hundreds of worlds. Sarah had become the Resistance's chief strategist. She advised cells on every world, adapting human tactics to local conditions. She had written 7 expanded versions of the Liberation Handbook, each one tailored to different environments and species. Her lectures were broadcast across the network, teaching new generations of fighters. Commanded a rapid response unit. He traveled from world to world, training cells in advanced tactics and helping plan major operations. He had trained over 10,000 fighters personally. His students had trained 100,000 more. The humans had become legends. Stories spread of the species that had taught the galaxy to resist. People whispered that humans had defeated the greatest empire in history with nothing but words and ideas. It was not entirely accurate, but myths rarely were. The turning point came on Prime itself, the hegemony's capital world, the heart of their power. A deep-cover resistance cell had spent 2 years infiltrating the government. They were not but member species from conquered worlds, working in bureaucratic positions that nobody watched carefully. A clerk here, a technician there, people who were invisible until they needed to be seen. They had used every trick Sarah taught them about information security. They had been patient. They had gathered intelligence while waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when the Supreme Commander called an emergency session of the High Council. The Resistance Cell had access to the meeting. They recorded everything. What they heard confirmed what the network had suspected. The hegemony was broken. Their military could not sustain the occupation. Their economy was in free fall. The Supreme Commander was arguing for a massive mobilization, conscripting more soldiers, stripping the core worlds to reinforce the occupation forces. Half the council opposed him. They wanted to negotiate a withdrawal. They wanted to cut their losses. The debate grew heated, then turned into a power struggle. The council splintered into factions. The resistance cell transmitted everything to the network. Within hours, it was broadcasting across every occupied world. The hegemony's leadership, fractured and afraid. The Supreme Commander, screaming at his own advisors. The economic minister, calling the occupation an unwinnable disaster. The effect was electric. On 40 worlds, resistance cells launched coordinated uprisings. They had been preparing for months, stockpiling weapons and training fighters. Now they struck all at once, timing their attacks to overwhelm this ability to respond. On 10,000 workers seized the mining facilities and expelled the garrison. On V, urban fighters took control of the capital city in 3 days of intense combat. On, the resistance captured the orbital defense network and turned it against ships trying to flee. The uprisings were broadcast live. Every success was documented. Every defeat was shown to the galaxy. The message was clear. The hegemony was finished. Garrison commanders began making independent decisions. Some fought to the death, destroying as much as they could before being overrun. Others negotiated local surrenders, trading their lives for safe passage. A few simply abandoned their posts and fled. The Supreme Commander ordered more orbital strikes, but now there was resistance even in his own military. Ship captains refused orders. Some defected. The empire was collapsing from within. 3 months after the recordings were leaked, the High Council voted to accept a ceasefire. The Supreme Commander was removed from power. The new leadership opened negotiations with the GLF. The peace talks were held on where it had all begun. Represented the resistance, backed by commanders from 50 liberated worlds. Sarah and stood beside him as advisors. The delegation was subdued, almost broken. They had come prepared to negotiate surrender, not peace. The demands were simple. Complete independence for all occupied worlds. War crimes tribunals for officers who had committed atrocities. Reparations for the damage done during the occupation. and a guarantee that the hegemony would never again wage wars of conquest. They tried to negotiate. They wanted to keep some territories, avoid the tribunals, limit the reparations, refused every compromise. He had 1,000 worlds behind him now, and they all wanted justice. "You have two choices," he said calmly. "Accept our terms or watch your empire burn. We will not stop. We cannot be stopped. You have already lost. This is just deciding how many more of your people die before you admit it." The delegation broke. They accepted everything. The Treaty of Liberation was signed 4 months later. One by one, forces from the occupied worlds. One by one, resistance cells became provisional governments. The process was messy and sometimes violent, but it moved forward. A year after the treaty, 900 worlds had achieved independence. The hegemony still existed, reduced to its core systems, a shadow of its former self. The liberated worlds began forming a new organization, the Galactic Confederacy, dedicated to mutual defense and preventing future conquests. In a city rebuilt from ashes, a ceremony was held. Representatives from all the liberated worlds gathered to honor those who had made freedom possible, stood at the podium, older and but finally at peace. "We are here because we learned to fight differently," he said to the assembled crowd. "We learned that the strong can be defeated, that occupation cannot withstand a people who refuse to be conquered. We learned these things from two humans who had no reason to help us except that they believed in freedom." Sarah sat in the audience trying to stay inconspicuous. It did not work. The crowd turned to them, cheering and chanting their names. They stood reluctantly, overwhelmed by the emotion. Later, at a smaller gathering, raised a glass to the humans. "You gave us more than tactics," he said. "You gave us the knowledge that freedom is possible, that the powerful are only as strong as the will of those they try to dominate." Sarah smiled tiredly. "We just showed you what we learned the hard way. Humanity has made terrible mistakes. We have been both oppressed and oppressors. But through all our wars and suffering, we learned one truth. People who want to be free will find a way. You found yours. And now we must make sure it never happens again," added. "The tactics that won your freedom can also be used by tyrants. You need to stay vigilant." "We will," promised. "We are building the Galactic Defense Academy. Every world will train fighters in the doctrine, not for conquest but as insurance, so that no empire will ever again enslave 1,000 worlds." The celebration continued into the night. Across the galaxy, on liberated worlds, people celebrated their freedom. They told stories of the resistance, of the brave fighters who had an empire. And they spoke of the humans, the strange species from a distant world called Earth, who had taught them how to win. Years later, human diplomats arrived in the Galactic Confederacy with full authority from Earth's government. They were greeted as heroes. Sarah had returned home long ago, but their legacy lived on. The Confederacy offered humanity a permanent seat in their council. They wanted to learn more from this species that understood the cost of freedom. Earth accepted. In the Academy new students studied the Liberation Handbook. They learned about improvised weapons and information warfare. They learned about small unit tactics and psychological operations. But most importantly, they learned about human history. The long, bloody, terrible history of a species that had fought countless wars and somehow emerged believing that freedom mattered more than power. A statue was erected in the Capitol showing 3 figures, in the center holding a rifle and a communication device. Sarah on one side holding a book, on the other in a fighter's stance. The inscription read simply, "They taught us to be free." The galaxy had changed. The hegemony's 1,000-world empire had become 1,000 free nations. The doctrine of asymmetric resistance had spread to every corner of known space. Future conquerors would face populations that knew how to fight back. The age of easy conquest was over. And humanity, the species that had stumbled into the occupied territories by accident, had become known throughout the galaxy as the Liberators. The species that turned their darkest history into a gift. The species that taught 1,000 worlds how to be free.